Good evening. It is really kind of exciting day to be with you. For the last number of years, I've been, I don't know why, but asked to be on the Vacation Bible School and to give a talk. But this is a little bit more special. I've been asked to give a talk here at Vacation Bible School, being part of the congregation again after all those years of being away. There's always something special about coming home. For the last few nights, we have really been very loosely dealing with Genesis chapter 1, talking about creation of the world and the things that are in the world. And we've been talking about what science really calls the evolution of the universe, how the universe came about, the evolution of the cosmos, if you will. And then after that, we really discuss this idea of the age of the earth. Right? Is the age of the earth billions and billions years old, or is the evidence pointing to a young earth? And then last night, Brother Dan dealt with the idea of the fossil record, and what do we find within the fossil record? Do we find billions and billions of years old of an earth? Is that proof of an old earth or not? And tonight we're going to really kind of consider within this idea of evidence of evolution, is there evidence found within animals for evolution? Is there something that we find within animals that can point to and say, right, we've seen animals evolve, and so therefore if animals evolve, then there must be something to this idea of evolution that, as science teaches it to us. I want us to consider first, before we go into this evidence, what the Bible says. In Genesis chapter 1, on day 5 and day 6 of creation, we find God creating the fish of the sea and the birds of the air on day 5. And on day 6, we see God creating the beasts of the field and every creeping thing that creeps upon the face of the earth. And then later within day 6, the creation of mankind as well. Genesis chapter 1, starting in verse 20. This version behind me is from the ESV, but I'll be reading from the New King's Version. It says, "Let the waters abound with an abundance of living creatures, and let the birds fly above the earth across the face of the firmament of the heavens. And so God created the sea creatures and every living thing that moves, with which the waters abounded according to their kind, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed him, saying, Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters of the sea. So the birds multiplied on the earth. And so the evening and morning were the 5th day. And God said, Let the earth bring forth living creatures, according to its kind, cattle and creeping thing and beasts of the earth, each according to its kind. And so it was. And God made the beasts of the earth according to its kind, cattle according to its kind, and everything that creeps on the earth according to its kind. And God saw that it was good." Time and time again you heard within that these verses, as Moses is recording by inspiration, after its kind. And that's going to be something important as we go through this lesson. But that's the biblical record that we have of the creation of animals. And as the biblical record shows to us, we see this idea within 6 days God created everything. Day 5 he created the fish of the sea and the birds of the air. And day 6, beasts and everything that creeps on the ground and mankind. Is there anything within this world that we can look at that points otherwise? Is there evidence of biological evolution, evidence of evolution in animals? Right? They're so similar. That may be a picture of me. The one in the glasses, I don't know. I think my wife put that in there. I'm not sure. But right, we see these similarities that happen. Does that prove to us that there are evolution within animals? Because of these similarities that exist. And I want us to think about some of these things that perhaps is evidence. Ernst Haeckel. You have probably seen this, without a doubt, seen this in your science textbook, probably around high school. It's been around for a very long time. Ernst Haeckel was a 1800s German biologist who studied the embryos of different animals. And here is a little bit of a better picture. You might be able to see that from your seats. But he came with this idea of embryonic recapitulation, which is the idea that these animals, which we have here in the screen behind me, fish, salamander, tortoise, chick, hog, calf, rabbit, and then lastly, human. And as he observed this, he noticed that the embryos at very early stages were very similar in how they developed. And so he proposed this idea that since there are similarities within the embryos, within the range of these animals, then there must be idea of a common ancestor. And then from that he proposed this idea that this is, within the embryos, evidence of evolution. Evolutionary history that is seen within the development of embryos. And as we kind of notice this drawings of the things that he observed, that there are a lot of similarities across the board with these different animals and their development of the embryos. And the next thing we really kind of notice, maybe another piece of evidence of evolution, and some of this was talked about last night with horses. Right, we've got the different metacarpals and metatarsals. The metacarpals are the things that are in our wrist, the bones that are in our wrist. The metatarsals are the bones within our feet. And we see a difference in these horses that are seen within the different layers of rock. And so the idea through this observation is that, okay, there's a change in the foot bones of horses throughout different years and different layers of rock. So therefore, evolution must be true, and evolution must be accurate because of these differences and because of these changes over long periods of time. Another piece of evidence comes from a few observations from Charles Darwin. He proposed this idea of natural selection as evidence for evolution, where animals change traits over time to adapt to their environment. You've probably seen this picture, right? As Charles Darwin went to the Galapagos Islands, he noticed many animals at the Galapagos Islands, and they differed from the animals that he knew were in different places. The finches had different beaks. They had smaller, sturdier beaks so that they could get the food out of the trees on this island, so they could crack open the nuts and the seeds on this island from the different diet that they had in different areas. And so he proposed, well, animals evolved over time to adapt to these changes. Something that we have seen relatively within our own time frame. This is the peppered moth. The peppered moth, the lighter colored moth, was kind of the predominant peppered moth for a number of years. And then around the Industrial Revolution, when we started pumping coal dust into the air, and as soot laid upon the trees, the darker colored peppered moth became more predominant. And so the idea from there, right, well, we see evolution within these animals, and that proves to us that animals evolved from some single-celled organism. Is that how it works? we need to really kind of consider some of these things, and we need to really reason through some of these things before we consider this evidence of biological evolution. First, how did life begin? Right? We come with this idea that there might be within the world some evidence of evolution where we see animals changing, perhaps. And so, before we get to that point, we have to ask the question, well, where did life even begin? How did it all start? Aristotle, back in 300s BC, came with this idea of spontaneous generation. Right? That just randomly something happened that caused life to begin. When we think about evolution of the cosmos, right, where all this energy was packed into a small point, and then all of a sudden there was this great explosion and the cosmos began, we've got inorganic material. We got rock. How did we go from rock to living organisms? Well, Aristotle proposed that it just spontaneously happened. That it just came about. That this idea that living organisms can arise from non-living, inorganic, inanimate substances. Back in the mid-1800s, Louis Pasteur is the guy with the big hair, is Francesco, I like that name, Francesco Redi. And Louis Pasteur is on the other side, and he's the guy that's got to be more notable about this idea of the law of biogenesis, where they did experiments, right? We think about science and what science is, and science is something that is observable, and science is something that is testable, and science is something that is repeatable. And so Louis Pasteur was kind of the lead for this study, and through his observations and through his testing, he came up with this idea that was called the law of biogenesis, whereas that life comes from life. Life can only come from life. Life cannot come from inorganic, inanimate objects. Life cannot come from rock. Life has to come from life. So, if evolution of the cosmos is true, then life had to come from non-living chemicals. And that means that the law of biogenesis had to, at some point in time, been broken. Except we know scientific laws cannot be broken. And there is no evidence of the scientific law of biogenesis ever being broken. Spontaneous generation, just the appearance of life, cannot be observed, cannot be tested, and cannot be repeated. Science answers this for abiogenesis. Abiogenesis, the idea that life did come from chemicals, or life did come from inanimate objects, is that you have to understand the condition of the earth about 4 billion years ago. Right? 4 billion years ago, the earth was different, and so therefore we have to understand that life was possible to come from inorganic things. Life can come from rock, because of the way the world was 4 billion years ago. And now you understand why they need billions upon billions of years. But here's something. All right, and so this evidence is out there. The mid-1800s, this experiment that Pasteur had done, and termed this idea the law of biogenesis. And love how sometimes science is honest. Sometimes science is brutally honest. Now, behind me is the quote from George Wald from about 1964, but I want to read to you a quote that he makes in Scientific America from 1954. He says when it comes to the origin of life, we only have two possibilities as to how life arose. One is spontaneous generation arising to evolution. The other is supernatural creative act by God. And he says this, there is no third possibility. It has to be one or the other. Spontaneous generation or a supernatural act from God. He says, but spontaneous generation was scientifically disproved 100 years ago by Louis Pasteur and the others, and that leads us scientifically to only one possible conclusion. Hear what he says. That life arose as a supernatural, creative act of God. Listen what he says next. I will not accept that philosophy because I do not want to believe in God. Therefore, I choose to believe in that which I know is scientifically impossible, spontaneous generation arising to evolution. So he knows that science doesn't support this idea of spontaneous generation. He knows that science disproved that idea of spontaneous generation. He knows that scientifically life cannot come from non-life. Life has to come from life, but I don't want to believe it because that means I have to believe in God. So therefore, I'm going to ignore the science and believe what I want to believe. Life from non-life is a massive hurdle that science needs to come over. To believe that life can come from non-life is irrational, it is unscientific, and it is a blind faith in pseudoscience. No answer can be given from the science community how life began, or why life began, or when it began. And so they theorize this idea of spontaneous generation, they theorize this idea of replicating molecules, and it cannot be reproduced. Replicating molecules, H2O, water, right? All of a sudden it just starts replicating, making itself. And then somehow from that turns into life. But we can understand, when we look at the Bible, the law of biogenesis is rational. It's logical. It makes sense when we understand that there was never a time when life had to come from non-life. That life came as a gift from the Creator. So number one, we ask this question of how. Right? How did life begin from non-life? Why did life begin from non-life? How did life begin from non-life? And when did it happen? Things that we cannot get answered through pseudoscience. Kind of another question that we need to ask is this idea of, well, if there was a first organism, how did it survive? How did that first organism begin to replicate itself? And if there was a single-celled organism that could, by chance, survive, and if, by chance, that single-celled organism could start to replicate and divide and begin to grow, how did that single-celled organism begin to morph into different animals? How did that single-celled organism then begin to replicate into human, replicate into fish, replicate into bird, into plants, fungus, right? How do you choose? Today I want to be a mushroom. How does that work? Right? How does that work? Something else that is really interesting with this idea of spontaneous generation in cells and how they replicate is this idea that even to think about how this would happen, that for everything to be perfect, for a cell to spontaneously generate. And for that cell to begin to divide and for that cell to begin to morph into other things, that it's impossible for that to happen. It's difficult to even contemplate how that would occur. We understand that, as a doctor told me not too long ago, that there are genetic glitches that happen. My daughter's not in here to pick on her, but we were told that my youngest daughter had a genetic glitch. There was nothing really wrong in her genetic code, but just nothing that was passed on through family, through genes, but just a glitch that happens that caused her bilateral congenital cataracts and glaucoma. It's just a glitch. We understand glitches happen in birth, right? We see it all over the world. But here's something we need to understand, that genetic code that is within an object, that genetic code that is within an organism cannot do something if that code isn't there. A fly can, through a genetic glitch, add an extra wing. It's kind of gross, I know. I'm not a feet kind of guy. It kind of grosses me out. But a genetic glitch can happen within a human, and you can have people with more than 10 toes. Right? They can have 6 toes and 1 foot, maybe even more than that. Get that picture out of your mind. But it can happen. But you know what can't happen? A human, due to a genetic glitch, can never grow a wing. It can't happen. That information within the DNA is not there for that to happen within a genetic glitch. We can grow extra toes. We can't grow a wing. That code has to already be within our genes for those things to happen. So how then do we move from a single-celled organism, if that can even occur spontaneously, and move into other things because of mutations? And this is just a quote from Stephen Gould, again, being real honest about science, and that cannot happen. Mutations do not create new, raw DNA for things like humans to grow wings to happen. That is not part of evolutionary change. And so there is no way to get something different than what we already have. And so what about this evidence of evolution? Right, we really kind of talked about 3 different evidences that we observe throughout our world today that might be evidence of evolution. So what about those things? The first thing we need to really talk about is the erroneous evidence. Lies. Disinformation. We don't have any of that going on in our world today, do we? Let's go back to Ernst Haeckel and his wonderful embryonic recapitulation. In 1997, embryologist Michael Richardson says of this chart, this is 1997, says of this chart that this chart is highly inaccurate and overly exaggerated. Not only in 1997, but Ernst Haeckel's colleague, William His, I don't know why you'd have a last name like that, William His, the colleague of Ernst Haeckel, says that once he started to formulate this idea and start having these drawings, that Haeckel invented these drawings. These things were never observed, but that he invented these things. And as science continues to, I'll say that, and science evolves, it says this was inadmissibly simplified, outdated, refuted, defunct, largely discredited, fraudulently modified, misinformation. And again, Michael Richardson says in the issue of Science magazine in 1997 that Haeckel's work was turning out to be one of the most famous fakes in biology. But guess what? You've seen it. and it's still within textbooks. It was still in the textbook in 2022. In this second picture that I had of this, I removed it from that slide. The larger picture I have of that came from a digital textbook for homeschool students this past week. So even though this information has already been shown to be fraudulent, we still print it in textbooks and we still teach it to children. That even though there are salamanders, and even though there are fish and tortoises, and that there are hogs and humans, we all have very similar embryonic growth. And so therefore, evolution within animals is true. Here's a question. Some of this stuff is adapted from Apologetics Press, and so some of these slides aren't from theirs. This is one of those things that I added into it. If we all evolved, right, let's think logically for a second. If we've all evolved from a single-celled organism, we all have a common ancestor, so therefore all of our genes should be pretty similar. Within vertebrates, which are animals that have a spine, right? Within vertebrates, every vertebrate has alpha keratin proteins. This isn't the vitamin that we take, but keratin. It's a protein that helps to grow hair. It's a protein that helps to grow nails, claws, teeth. Every vertebrate has this. But only birds and reptiles have beta keratin proteins. But if we all evolved from, as this chart shows us, that we all evolved from just the evolution of the cosmos and then somehow replicating water, and then somehow from that some single-celled organism, and then from that this swamp-like creature, we should all have the same type of proteins that are replicating from our DNA, and it's not there. Nobody in this room has beta carotene proteins that are replicating from your DNA. Why is that? And if we all have a common ancestor. Back to this, the evolution of the horse, right? As Dan kind of mentioned yesterday, if you're here yesterday, talking about the different sizes of horses, right? We think about how that is, and what's, do you know this thing? The capybara. It's the largest rodent in the world. And you can see how large this rodent is. You don't want this thing running around in your house like a mouse, right? But you can see how large this rodent is by the bird that's on his back. He's massive. Look at his feet. If you can see his feet, doesn't his feet match almost exactly with the three-toed metatarsals that's on that first picture of that ancient, from 14 million years ago, horse that is supposedly within the fossil record? And doesn't that capybara look almost exactly like the digital rendition that they have supplied for us for that animal that's up there saying it's some kind of ancient horse? Perhaps they're just other animals and not some sort of evolved horse. Fraudulent, erroneous evidence. The second thing I want us to look at are things that are irrelevant. All right, things that don't tell us anything about evolution, but it just tells us there are some changes within the environment. We go back to this idea of Charles Darwin with natural selection. We go back to these finches. Adaptations or changes within a species is not evolution. Right? Macroevolution is the idea of a new species evolving from a species. That something evolves from a human and is a whole different alien thing, right? A change in species. It is not an adaptation of the species itself. The different beaks within these finches that were observed are not proof for evolutionary changes. Macroevolutionary changes. In fact, there are 20 different genera of finches and 137 different species of finches. There's a lot of differences within the finches, but yet they're all finches from the same family. We go back to the pepper moth. All right, we think about this idea of the pepper moth. What's the difference between the white and the black pepper moth? One's white, one's black. What are they? Pepper moths. Right? There's not been any change there other than a little bit of a difference in their coloring. And their coloring is already within their genetic code. So there's no changes within the species, or just a change in their coloring, but it's still a moth. It does not give us any information of biology for evolution. And we see it every day, right? We breed things for the sole purpose of our enjoyment. And we breed them together to give us something that we want. It's not evolution at all. Selective breeding. Something else that we see that is thrown at us as evidence, and we really kind of talked about how similar we are. Right? Well, we're similar because we're all animals. All right? So there's got to be some similarity there. We're all animals and we're not plants. And so our cell walls are similar. We have a soft cell wall, not a rigid cell wall like plants have. And so there's some similarities there at the basic cell level. And then as we start separating and differentiating between this lineage categories of animals, those differences become greater and greater and greater. But they're similar because they have a similar designer, right? We think about the idea of sedans. A four-door sedan looks like a four-door sedan if it's made by Ford, if it's made by Chevy, or it's made by Toyota. Why? Because it's a four-door sedan. It's all made with the same idea within the mind. We don't have to look very far to see this logically. We look over at Maxwell Acres, right? A lot of those houses all look the same. You got two different types, maybe three different types of houses within Maxwell Acres, and it's all because it was built by the same people. Similar design tells us a common designer. So I want us to think about an answer to evolution. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 39. All right, we notice in Genesis chapter 1 this idea of kind. Reproduce after their own kind. Right? And it's the idea of species. That these animals, right, the cattle will reproduce after its own kind. The cattle will reproduce after its own species. You cannot mate a cow and a dog. You're crossing species boundaries. It's not going to happen. And we see the same idea in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 9. For all flesh is not the same flesh, but there is one kind for humans, another kind for animals, another for birds, and another for fish. It's almost as if God knew that after His creation happened, that His creation is going to try to discredit God, and they were going to have this idea that we spontaneously generated from a single-celled organism, and then from that we evolved into these different animals, and that we have a common ancestor of fish, a common ancestor of the chimpanzee. And God said in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 39, through the Apostle Paul, no. My great-great-great-grandfather may have looked like a chimpanzee. He may act like a chimpanzee, but he wasn't. Our ancestry is not in fish, but we are created by the living God. Notice what Job says. Job is a fascinating record of a lot of science, right? Job talks about the empty circle above. Job talks about the water cycle. Job talks about a lot of things that have a scientific background. Notice what he says. He says, ask the beasts, and they will teach you. Ask the birds of heaven, and they will tell you. Ask the bushes of the earth, and they will teach you. And the fish of the sea, and they will declare to you, who among all these does not know the hand of the Lord has done this? As we are people who are believers of the Bible because of the evidence that it is within the Bible. And Job is reminding us that the birds of the air, the fish of the sea, and the cattle that are in the field are smarter because they know they were created by God. They are smarter than those who believe in spontaneous generation. They are smarter than those who believe that we just happened by chance and by time. In His hand, Job continues to say, is the life of every living thing and the breath of all mankind. That's how much God thinks about you. He has given everything into our hand. In Psalm 8 and verse 4, what is man that you are mindful of him, the Son of Man that you care for him? God created every single one of us. Everything that we read within the Bible is said that God breathed the man into existence. God breathed the fish in the sea into existence, the birds in the air into existence, and the beasts that roam on the fields into existence. And there's nothing within the biblical record that would discredit that fact. We can be trusting and have full assurance of faith knowing that that biblical record is accurate. There's evidence for it. But where's the evidence that we spontaneously generated and then we evolved from some single-celled organism without a creator? But God gave into our hand all things within this life. Genesis chapter 3. Created all for us. But He didn't stop there. Right? He didn't stop there with what He created. He didn't just make the plants and the trees for us to have shade and for us to have oxygen. He just didn't create the beasts of the field for us to have food in our belly. He didn't stop there with the beauty of His creation for us to sit back and enjoy the beautiful sunsets. But He sent His Son because He's mindful of us. He understands there was a sin problem, Isaiah chapter 59, verses 1 and 2, that sin separated us from Him. And He made the way by sending Jesus Christ to this earth to live that perfect life and to be the ultimate sacrifice to take away the sins of the world, to take away my sin, to take away your sin, so that we could have a right relationship with Him. And so that we can have a home of heaven. There was more to us than just flesh and bone. There is more to us than just air in our lungs and blood in our veins. But we are given a soul. Genesis chapter 1, God breathed into us the breath of life. He gave us a soul. And we have the opportunity, if we believe in Him, if we trust in Him, and if we obey Him, that our soul can go back to the one who gave it. Do you believe in Jesus Christ, the Son of God? Do you believe that God created everything that we know and that we see? Are you willing to trust in Him, put your faith into Him? Are you willing to allow Him to be your Lord and your Savior? Are you willing to walk away from your own desires and your own lusts and become a child of God? I'd urge that you would do it before it's too late. To give your life over to Him. To die to yourself in the waters of baptism. Having your sin washed away and arising from that as a new creation. Not something evolved, but something loved by God. And to do it tonight as together we stand and as we sing.